This is an all-in interview with David Sax, who is the crypto czar currently at the White House, and Senator Eric Schmitt, who was the AG that helped uncover Biden malfeasance in terms of dealing with the social media companies. This is about freedom of speech, which is one of my number one values that I believe must be protected, and I wish the rest of the world could speak as freely as we can in the United States. And in appreciation of the First Amendment, I'm going to guide you through this and leave the occasional comment.
And here we go.
And I remember talking about, before I even knew you, on the All-In Pod when we were dealing with censorship and talking about that issue, the Twitter files. This is back in, I don't know, this is like 3 or 4 years ago.
2022, I would say, 3 years ago now. Time is moving.
We talked about the case Biden v. Missouri, which you were the one who brought that case when you were Attorney General. When I met you and then found that out, I knew that we had some views in common, let's say, about free speech and the need to avoid censorship.
And you went right at the show me, don't tell me with your fancy speak what's going on. You went directly to discovery. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the approach from the senator from the Show Me State. There were rumors and kind of this feeling people were being censored, but nobody knew exactly how it was occurring. So you had some intuition that if we do some discovery here, there's got to be something under the surface, or had somebody leaked something to you? How did you know to go after this, I guess, was my question.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I wrote the book was just to, I think it's easy. The book starts with, in November 2024, the fever broke. And so if you think about the 4 previous years, this was a time of lockdowns and compulsory COVID shots and forced masking of 5-year-olds, but also this vast censorship enterprise that existed that
the authoritarian state that the Democrats were trying to install, for which I will never forgive them and never vote for the blue team ever again.
I think we need to push back on this. There's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy.
In my view, was the greatest affront to the First Amendment we've ever seen in the history of our country. And
Absolutely.
So if you go back in time, right, to in 2022, you had seen, to your point, Jason, you had seen sort of Jen Psaki at the podium talking about, hey, we're flagging this for Facebook. There were rumors of a disinformation governance board with the Mary Poppins herself, talking about how this misinformation and disinformation.
Jankovich, I think, right?
Right.
Wasn't that her name?
That they needed to flag this stuff and do something about it. We knew that if they were willing to talk about that stuff so publicly, there had to be something much more beneath the surface. So in May of 2022, when I was Attorney General of Missouri, we sued the Biden administration and sort of this leviathan of agencies that were working to censor American speech. And we filed the lawsuit, and we knew that it would be, highly scrutinized, be called sort of furthering conspiracy theories, but we knew that there was something there. And a really important strategic decision in the case was, normally when you file a lawsuit like that, you immediately seek a temporary restraining order or a preliminary injunction to get the government or another party to stop what they're doing. But we felt like we needed to get evidence first, right? We had the allegations in the complaint. So we sought discovery, and the judge granted that discovery. And what we found from that discovery was shocking, right? We got reams and reams, tens of thousands of documents, emails, text messages about this communication, the special portals that existed for, these folks in big government to work with big tech to silence Americans. And so it really was shocking. And then, of course, we got to the point where we were able to take depositions. We took the deposition of Anthony Fauci. We took the deposition of Elvis Chan, who was the FBI agent in charge of Northern California that was pre-bunking the Hunter Biden laptop story, even though the FBI had the laptop in 2019, right? So
is there anything more nefarious than that, than pre-bunking a story that the FBI knows to be true with one of its own agents embedded in the companies that distribute messaging around the world? That just shows you the level of corruption. And good on Eric Schmitt for being so brave and farsighted to be able to bring this lawsuit that was one of the things that helped save America and our right to speak freely. Because if Kamala had been elected, if the Democrats were still in power, they'd just be taking the axe to the tree of free speech.
Our First Amendment stands as a major block to the ability to be able to just, hammer it out of existence. So what we need is to win the ground. win the right to govern by hopefully having, winning enough votes that you're free to be able to implement change.
We took the deposition of a CDC official who was basically flagging specific words and phrases that the government would then censor. And then agencies like CISA, all of these groups were part of this enterprise. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, The Last Line of Defense, that people can get on Amazon right now. We go inside those deposition rooms. You go inside the prep for that. What were we trying to find out? What did we find out? How we uncovered this? Because you got to remember, this was before Elon bought Twitter.
Yeah.
And before the Twitter files.
Yeah. We
right?
joined him there for those first couple of days. Yeah.
What's interesting about this is that you were taking the discovery from the government side. So you were getting the government documents, you were deposing government witnesses, and then Elon released the Twitter files, I don't know, about 6 months later. And then we saw it from the Twitter side.
Yeah.
And this was happening at Facebook too, right? Like you had information
Facebook.
On the Facebook side. Yeah.
Yeah, you had Meta.
It's happening in all the social media companies, and that includes YouTube, which is maybe less censorious than Facebook, but it's pretty bad. Definitely less censorious than Reddit, by the way. But the reason that they have a leverage over these companies, those in power, is because the European Union and their politicians see American tech companies as a digital piñata that they can strike over and over again and take billions of cash to fund their socialist programs. And as Trump is doing right now in terms of not agreeing to certain parts of the tariffs and trade with Europe, is he's leveraging U.S. economic might to prevent Europe from stealing and from our social media companies, because that's what they want to do with all sorts of lawsuits in order to employ censorship as to what the rest of the world gets to see. And this is the leverage that they have over them that Biden administration allowed them to use and would allow them to be coerced by the European Union because it did their own bidding to keep certain stories under wraps.
You had YouTube. This was all happening. And the way it was working was, as you guys know, these big tech platforms have something called Section 230 protection, right? Which is basically in the 90s when the internet's becoming a thing, Congress says, you're not a publisher, you're a platform, so you can't be sued. That is a huge advantage. And by the way, if they're actually acting as a platform, as a proponent of free speech, almost as a free speech absolutist, that's a great thing. The problem was a lot of these entities were then becoming publishers. They were throttling things they didn't like. They were taking down opinions they didn't support, that sort of thing. And so what you had was Joe Biden saying maybe there's criminal liability. You saw these text messages in the lawsuit from Rob Flaherty, who was the deputy communications director of the White House, cussing these guys out, saying, you need to know that from the highest levels of the White House, we see this, you're not doing enough. And so as much as I think some of the people at these big tech companies were willing participants, there was a coercion that was happening. And that's the basis of the lawsuit, which was, we all know the government can't censor speech, but you also can't outsource that censorship to private companies, which is exactly what was going down. And I think exposing that was really important. Of course, Elon and all the work that he's done in making that a true free speech platform then, and then of course the congressional hearings that followed. I think all of this has sort of laid the groundwork for this kind of free speech renaissance that we're experiencing. One of the things, when I was in college, in the late 90s, I was always pretty conservative. One thing I was kind of jealous of liberals was that they kind of had the high ground on free speech. They were viewed as sort of like the vanguard, and even the ACLU actually did things like protect free speech. That's all gone now. Like that, there's no, it's about power and control and limiting and labeling things, misinformation, disinformation to suppress speech. So I think it's an interesting moment right now for this new coalition that came together to elect President Trump, which is, for me, exciting. It's kind of a working class coalition. So
just to steelman it, Senator, we know that our foreign adversaries, this is bipartisan for many decades, interfere in our elections. We know they do that. You would agree, yeah? This has been
they certainly would try to influence.
Certainly try, right? And of course, we could be like, hey, is it possible in 50 different states with 50 different set of regulations? Pretty hard to actually tip an election, as we've seen, right? If you look at that, if we steelman a foreign adversary, because this is the cover that they were seeking. Hey, we're doing this to protect America and democracy. But the truth was, they were doing it for their own personal reasons and their affiliation with one particular party. If you just look at the percentage of people who are Democrats at those companies, it's like 80, 90, 95%. So I think we all agree on that. Is there a way for the FBI, for the CIA, for our government to say to Twitter, to Facebook, hey, you've got people here who are foreign adversaries. They're doing something that is against the American public. We need you to monitor this account and take them down. What would have been the proper channel as opposed to setting up a covert back channel where they kind of threatened them? One layer here that I've never heard anybody connect, but when I was listening to your Tucker interview, it just dawned on me. They also put Lena Khan in. Now, Zuckerberg is a cutthroat business executive. He likes to buy companies. That's his thing. And Twitter was known for buying a lot of companies. So now you got Lena Khan saying, we're gonna come down hard on you, not let you buy anything. And at the same time, this other group from the Biden administration is saying, hey, take this stuff down. So they had two really big clubs to threaten these folks. But what would be the proper channels to say, hey, these things are stolen, right?
Yeah, there's a difference between sort of making people aware versus the coercion that was happening under the threat of investigations or losing Section 230 protections, right? That was our argument, which was this went beyond informing, and this was about colluding and coercing, which of course then crosses the line of what the government can do, as far as violating the First Amendment. There's also, to your point, there's a couple of things that are happening at the same time here. The first is kind of this, honestly, is kind of legacy of the whole Russiagate hoax stuff, in that they concocted this this theme that is playing out now. Like Tulsi Gabbard is exposing a lot of stuff, but that gave them in their view, that gave them the guys to talk about Russia this, Russia that. Everything that they don't like is misinformation, disinformation, right? The other thing that was happening with Zuckerberg in particular, you got to remember, if you go back to 2016, a lot of people blamed him. If you didn't like Trump, they blamed him because they thought that somehow what was happening on Facebook contributed to his election and it shouldn't have happened. But then, of course, he then is part of the whole Zuckerbucks movement in the lead up to 2020. Then he comes back around and Biden's in office. Then he's pressured, and he kind of, on Joe Rogan, kind of talks about the lengths at which they went to pressure him. And now it seems as though maybe he's been red-pilled again. I don't really know where that's at.
No, I can tell you, he's a weather vane. That's just how you know which way the wind's blowing. Zuckerberg.
Right. So yeah,
just like Jason Kalanos in the upper right-hand corner, also a weather vane that he describes Mark as, but that's just little inside baseball as I follow the All In podcast, and I think it's really good.
Like, it's out of expedience.
Who he's behind is just a
But it's interesting, like him as sort of this kind of, maybe that's the right word, of kind of how this was vacillating from one place to the next. Well, but the point is,
if Kamala won, he would have been all in for Kamala. 100%. He would have been at the inauguration for her. He would have donated to her. Trust me, we know him. It's my opinion.
Well, I give him a little more credit in the following sense, is that Zuckerberg gave a speech a while back where he talked about how social networking was the fourth estate, and you've got the media and then you got social networking, and it's very disruptive, and therefore people want to censor it. And he basically supported that we should have freedom of speech for social networking like we do for the press, because it's equally important. And I think that is his actual view. It's just that the question is, how much stomach does he have for fighting the government when it's pressuring him and coercing him, and some other part of the government is basically threatening to break up his company, right?
Yeah. Right.
Like a fifth estate, right? And so I think that if he wasn't being pressured by the government at all and just left to his own devices, I think he'd be fairly pro-free speech. But I just think that he wasn't really willing to take up the banner and fight the way that Elon was, and
he's
really
the anti-Elon in that respect. He's the anti-Elon.
Elon deserves so much credit for saving free speech, for saving America technologically. I mean, without SpaceX, I don't think America would have a leg up in the space race compared to everybody else, but we do with thanks to Elon. And here are all the leftist tards that have been assembled to try to destroy Tesla because he stood up for free speech and tried to eliminate wasteful spending by the federal government. How does that make sense, other than the fact that these people are completely corrupt and trying to take away our freedoms and trying to slowly destroy America while they take every dollar, like pigs at a trough from us via taxes so that they can give it to their cohorts, so they can give it to Stacey Abrams to spend $2 billion at the end of the Biden administration, call it throwing gold over the deck of the Titanic as it sinks the Biden administration.
He cares about his stock price. He cares about money. This is my interpretation. And he's going to protect the franchise and the stock price.
But that's what most business people would do. I mean, I think Elon was an outlier in terms of being willing to fight for principle, which is why I think that going back to the central premise of Biden v. Missouri, when the government is jawboning these companies, instructing them to take down content or highly suggesting it and basically threatening that there'll be repercussions if they don't, most business people are going to give in to that.
Of course.
And it is de facto censorship.
Well, and if you think
that's actual literal fascism, where you have the state and government colluding to do what neither can do on its own. The government getting the companies getting favors from the government, like I described earlier in terms of the European Union, and the government being able to censor speech. It's using their threats of the leverage that they have and being prosecutions and dragging them into court and spending millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in lawyer fees. It's just crazy.
About it too. I mean, there's just a couple of things. If they didn't happen, all of this stuff would still be considered a conspiracy theory, or we wouldn't know about it. Like if we didn't, nobody else had filed. If we didn't file that lawsuit and seek discovery, and if the richest guy on the planet doesn't choose to buy Twitter and expose all of that, people would still be claiming that this was some conspiracy theory, right? Like we wouldn't, if you just think of the world would be a much different place right now. And so I think that's a big success.
Well, I agree. And just to take people back, you're exactly right that conservatives were called crazy and conspiracy theorists for believing that Twitter, then Twitter, was shadow banning and throttling traffic. And I remember when Elon took over, we had the Twitter transition and Jake Hall and I were there and we were just helping out the first couple of weeks. And it was mostly just getting org charts and trying to rationalize the org structure. And Elon went in and started making cuts. But then I think I left around Thanksgiving and we were all kind of with our families. And, I think we went down to Mexico and Elon was still there working. And I remember I got a text from him at like 2 a.m. Like, are you up?
You up?
You up?
You up?
And
Is it going to be a banger?
Yeah, I'm like, sure. Yeah. So anyway, he calls. And basically what he told me was that all the conspiracy theories are true, that we've now gone into the admin tools that the trust and safety team was using. And they literally have checkboxes to throttle accounts based on exclude them from search. And
Jack Dorsey assured everyone on national television over and over that Twitter did not shadow ban. He said that on Joe Rogan, I believe. He lied. That's a big disappointment because he's big on Bitcoin. But yeah, he must have been in a spicy situation.
They had all these different tools that they had created, again, to throttle traffic, which was effectively shadow banning. So they could just ban you outright, or they could prevent your content from being seen. In other words, everything that conservatives had claimed was true.
And to add to that, Senator, before you respond, the thing that's particularly interesting about this is you talked about 230. We want platforms to have 230. But when you start making editorial decisions, when you're the New York Times and you say, hey, this is going on the front page, it's an editorial decision. When you assign the story, that's an editorial decision. The 230 was given to platforms that didn't make editorial decisions. This is an editorial decision. To say Milo Yiannopoulos or Laura Loomer or Alex Jones, whatever the reason is, they could be anti-Semitic, they could be crazy, they could,
or the president of the United States, which was ultimately
we'll get into that one for sure, because there's a lot of good questions there.
This is one of the things that Elon had done that
Jason Kalanos, the guy that I called the weather vane earlier, was very much in favor of Alex Jones remaining deplatformed on Twitter and went on to Twitter Spaces and basically stated so. That's why I don't have a lot of respect for that guy. You have to be consistent and uphold your values at all times. As he claimed about Mark Zuckerberg, it's confession via projection. He is a weather vane and kind of a shitlib, to be honest.
Very day was he opened up the Twitter jails and let Trump back onto the platform. And I think there were some others. Jordan Peterson was censored.
But you know what?
Jay
It was a little bit
Bhattacharya.
of like Arkham's Asylum. You did let a couple of crazy people back on too.
Tate. No, all the bad
There you
boys
go.
of free speech were let out.
Yeah.
I mean, it was Trump, Tate, Jordan Peterson, Jay
I mean,
Bhattacharya, folks like
I would
that.
put Jordan
think that-
Peterson
The public doesn't need to be protected from any of these people.
No, Milo Yiannopoulos and Alex Jones, you may find them loathsome or funny or anything in between, but it is freedom of speech. But, Senator, this has led to a discussion of 230 being repealed. And this is where I think, the lawsuit you did, and there could be further work, is clarifying the nuance of 230. Should an algorithm de facto be an editorial decision? So if you have an algorithm and you say, hey, I'm going to show you more MAGA stuff, I'm going to show you more AOC, that's an editorial decision in my mind. Should that break Section 230 if somebody decides to build an algorithm that shapes the content you see when you open the app, just like the New York Times editors do?
Right. That's sort of like in the Last Line of Defense book is sort of like, what are the solutions are? We talk about what's the proper role of Section 230. Because I actually think if you are a true platform as somebody, again, that believes in free speech, it's a very important thing. One of the concerns, like I'm not a doomsday guy on AI. I think there's I think it can add to human flourishing. I think it can actually make us more productive. And there's a lot of opportunities that roll with it. One of the things I'm most concerned, though, is about censorship creeping in to AI, right? And so I think you have to be very clear that if you're going...
Well, we already know that AI is infused with woke values. If you take a look at the initial Gemini, when you asked it to create a picture of the founding fathers, George Washington turned out to be black. You asked it to create an image of a beautiful white couple, it would not. It would say, I can't do that. But if you asked it to do so for a black couple, a beautiful black couple, it would do it in a heartbeat. And you better believe that this is continuing because these are the values of those that are dictating how the AI will behave. So this is a very big question, is what AI do you choose? And are these AIs going to be battling each other? And are we all going to have a different slant of the world based on the AI that we choose, much like we get from our publications and what we choose to consume there?
To start making these, whether it's somebody individually is flagging it, or you have an algorithm that is essentially excluding 50% of the points of view, you should not get the multi-billion-dollar subsidy that effectively what Section 230 protection is, right? It's a huge advantage, and it should. And by the way, I'm all for that, but I think this manipulation that, by the way, is sort of sewn into the hearts.
Though, the algorithm, because you know what an algorithm is. You're like a tech savvy guy, and it's great to have senators who are.
But you can't. But like just like government.
How can you have an algorithm that's designed to produce a certain output? How can you have that coexist with 230 is my question. I have my own answers, but I'm curious in your answer.
Yeah, I think you got to get back to one of the First Amendment principles, which is it has to be content neutral. That's how I view it. Now, you can have protections. There are certain public safety protections that are going to play. You could have protections against people, sort of pedophilia that would violate terms of service. Something there is a role
would violate
for terms of
laws, right? I mean,
correct.
Yeah.
But I also think what's interesting is when you go back and look at this case, the pressure on the platforms wasn't just about phrases. They made them alter terms of service to actually meet what the desired outcomes that they wanted. And also, and David, you saw this. Interestingly, the kind of how deep the rot really was. Let's just take Twitter for an example. James Baker, who's James Baker? James Baker was the general counsel for the FBI during the the briefings during the Russiagate back then, at the end of 2016. He then, after a stint at some think tank, becomes the general counsel at Twitter.
He was the one inside Twitter, we now know from the Twitter files, was advocating to censor the Hunter Biden laptop story, even though he should have known.
Is that not utter corruption? That you have an intelligence service whose duty is to weed out crime, to arrest criminals, to protect the American people, and they're all in on this false narrative that they know the Hunter Biden laptop is true, but they have somebody inside of Twitter saying, suppress the story. That, in my opinion, is a jailable offense. It is using our intelligence apparatuses and the power that they have against the American people, against truth, and against democracy. And they called Donald Trump the threat to democracy.
Based on his time at the FBI, that the laptop was authentic, i.e. it was Hunter Biden's actual laptop. And the grounds upon which that story was censored was that the laptop was Russian disinformation. This was the tried and true tactic for years, is that any speech that was inconvenient and that Democrats wanted to censor, they just called Russian disinformation, even though the Russians had nothing to do with that laptop.
And to dig even further into that, what's interesting is, so Elvis Chan is the guy at the FBI in late 2019, 2020, is briefing the big tech companies monthly, at least monthly, then it becomes weekly. And we took his deposition in the Missouri versus Biden lawsuit, and it was kind of shocking. You read about it in the book, but like what he talked about was they had the Hunter Biden laptop in November of 2019. The FBI did. They knew it was real. Like they knew it was real. It's Hunter Biden's laptop.
100%.
Yoel Roth, as you remember, who was like the integrity guy at Twitter, signs an affidavit with the FEC after a complaint was filed against Twitter, noting specifically that the FBI was telling them that this could be a Hunter Biden. So this wasn't just going to be some random hack and leak operation from the Russians. It was related specifically to Hunter Biden.
Senator, in fairness, the Russians did hack Hillary Clinton's email. That was confirmed. And
We don't know that.
of course we
don't
do.
know
The
that.
FBI confirmed it. Absolutely was confirmed.
I think
And-
that's all part of the hoax.
Kabam! Here you go with the shit lib. Let's hope he gets his ass kicked.
Okay, well, let me give you a couple of reasons why I could see the New York Post. We could see the platform saying if the FBI calls and says it's a Russian hack, and we've had a bunch of Russian hacks before, and the president said, you should, hey, Russia, if you're listening, send me the emails, and you had Paul Manafort be indicted
You're like
for
the last
having all
person who
these
still
connections.
believes in this Russiagate hoax.
No,
You're missing
let me
the key
finish my
point,
point.
which is the
I'll-
laptop
we
was
can get your key
authentic and
point.
the
We'll get
FBI
your key
knew it
point,
was
David. Let me
authentic.
finish mine. Let me finish mine, and you can give me the key point. Tell me why.
Jason Kalanos is not as smart as the other Olin guys. He's just not, and he's a shit lib, and he's a weather vane.
I'm wrong. There was a bunch of
He is rich.
noise around Russia. I think Russia did this on purpose to cause chaos here. I don't think they cared who got in. I think they just want chaos. That's my personal belief. But if you were Twitter and the FBI calls and says, hey, this was hacked, and we have these previous instances of hacking that the FBI has confirmed and has told the world this is what happened,
Confirmed
and
via
you have
lies.
Paul Manafort being indicted, and you have all this other noise, it's a reasonable thing for Facebook or Twitter, in my mind, to say, okay, maybe we wait a week. Maybe this is like the Russians really are doing this. I don't blame them as much. Do you?
Well, the truth is, like, there's parallel tracks here. First of all, we know now that that Trump was some Russian asset. All that's totally fake. That's like it. Like
No, he's not an
indisputable.
asset. We all agree on that.
It didn't happen. But they use that, of
But
course.
that's what they were trying to frame Trump as. They said over and over that he was a Russian asset, that he's an illegitimate president after he got elected because he's a Russian asset, because the Russians helped him. All lies, and every single American out there should be incredibly angry that they were lied to. Incredibly angry that these people then use this as the predicate to get censorship laws in place and to be able to run the Hunter Biden laptop psyop by claiming that it was Russian disinformation. It all goes hand in hand in hand. And the level of corruption, somebody's got to pay the price. They really do.
Than to spy on a presidential candidate. That's what Barack Obama did. And then you had, of course, Brennan and Clapper and Comey continue this and really tried to sidetrack a presidential administration. So I think indictments are probably coming. That's a sort of a
Treason.
separate issue. The reality is because
treason.
you know, even though statute of limitation may have expired, a conspiracy, if ongoing, the statute of limitation has not expired. So we'll see where that all goes. But if you're making the point that the government shouldn't be having that much influence in coercing and threatening these big tech companies, I would agree with you. That's a violation of the First Amendment. My point is, the idea that the big tech was so willingly going along with all this, though, right, is a little scary. These are some of the biggest companies in the history of the world. And the idea that something that the FBI knew to be true wasn't out there for the American people to sort of weigh in on 10 days before an election is kind of Orwellian.
But that's
And
on
so-
the FBI, I think. Not the
the
platforms.
FBI.
It's on the FBI. It's on those dictating to the FBI what to do. It's a conspiracy. That literally is a conspiracy amongst many people to suppress information.
Totally unclean hands here. There's no doubt about that.
Okay. Yeah, let me jump in here with a couple of
Yeah, go ahead.
points. So, okay, let's just focus on this Hunter Biden story because I think there is a very plausible argument that the censorship of this story could have swung the results of the 2020 election. Okay, because the Hunter Biden laptop showed a bunch of shady foreign business dealings between the Biden family and China and Ukraine and other countries. And if that had been properly examined by the media instead of being censored by social media 10 days before the election, who knows what the outcome would have been. So this was a major, major deal. Now, why did that story get censored? We now know from the Twitter files, this is the reporting of Matt Taibbi, who was given access to the Twitter files, that, like Eric is saying, the FBI knew in late 2019 that the laptop was real because they had it.
Glenn Greenwald, when he was at The Intercept, validated that the Hunter Biden laptop was real very quickly, within a day. And believe it or not, the paper that he helped found, The Intercept, didn't want to print the story because they were all in to get Hunter elected and they were anti-Trump. At least Greenwald has some credibility as an honest broker because he left The Intercept over that.
In their possession and therefore authenticated it. What was their reaction to it? In my view, they could have done three different things. Number one is they could have investigated the crimes that were suggested by the evidence on that laptop. They didn't do that. Number two is they could have just sat on it and done nothing. They didn't do that. They did number three, which is they basically began a campaign to suppress the contents of the laptop. How do they do that? Elvis Chan, representing the FBI, was engaged in weekly meetings with these social networks. Again, this is from the Twitter files. And Elvis Chan represented the intelligence community. One of the emails described his group as the belly button of the conduit between the social networks and the intelligence community. And remember, Elvis Chan had something like 80 FBI agents who are submitting takedown requests to Twitter and other social networks. So this is the scale of the censorship that was happening. In any event, in these...
Think about that scale, people. Anybody out there watching, leave a comment. Let me know what you think of that. Is this news to you?
Weekly IC meetings, and a lot of the evidence has been destroyed because they were using that disappearing tool, teleport. In any event, in these weekly meetings, we now know that they were warning the social networks, be on the lookout for a Russian disinformation campaign in which Hunter Biden is accused of something. And so they, for months, were priming the social networks to view any story, any revelations about Hunter Biden as being Russian disinformation.
This is what Mark Zuckerberg disclosed on Joe Rogan, for the record.
Now, why were they doing that? In fact, there was at one point, there was what was called a quote unquote tabletop exercise where all the heads of trust and safety at these social networks were brought, I think they were brought to the Aspen Institute, and they literally ran a tabletop exercise where they said, okay, 2 weeks before the election, the Russians are going to do an oppo dump on Hunter Biden. What's your response to that going to be? And where they all ended up is that they would censor the story. I mean, this is like crazy Orwellian stuff. I mean,
it makes sense for, just to steelman it, for them to want to do the right thing if the FBI is telling them it's Russian disinformation.
Oh, I don't blame the social networks. They were
that's what I'm trying. That's the only point I'm trying to make.
And Zuckerberg went on Rogan. Remember when Zuckerberg went on Rogan and he said the reason why we censor that story is because the FBI had told us to. Most people in that situation would have believed the FBI.
All three of them.
To reason.
The point is, though, that the FBI, again, they could have investigated the crimes on the laptop. They could have sat on the laptop and done nothing. That's not what they did. Instead, they began this campaign to discredit the eventual revelations as Russian disinformation.
Senator, what happened to those individuals at the FBI? I'm curious if you can get to that as well, who were involved in all this. Were they ever brought up on charges?
No.
Did we ever figure out who they are?
There needs to be accountability here, because I also think it's important to point out that, so take CISA, which is the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. No one's ever heard of it. It was created effectively to protect infrastructure from cyber attacks. In that era when Trump was president, underground, they work on, under the guise of Russian disinformation, what's called the Election Integrity Project. So they work with Stanford, they work with University of Washington to flag, post, to work with social media companies. Then when you get into COVID, they just flip the switch and turn it on any, if you're questioning the efficacy of the vaccine or you're questioning the efficacy of masks,
and I got strikes for that, and I almost lost my channel in its initial stages because I was questioning this, because I was actually right about most of COVID. Terrible, terrible stuff. They don't allow the truth to come out because there's too much money to be made or too much to gain politically by allowing people to debate. Evil people. And by the way, maybe not treason, sedition, whatever you want to call it.
Turn that around in the American people too. So part of the point that's outlined in the book, Last Line of Defense, which you can order right now on Amazon, the part of the point was exposing all this was a Leviathan. This wasn't just like one person making a phone call. This was all these agencies that were lined up with the regime's narrative and then working and coercing and threatening social media companies. You will take this down or there will be consequences. And so, the CDC, I mentioned the CDC, what were they doing? The government went to them and said, tell us the phrases that you want us to flag and take down, and then we will work with social media companies effectively, right, to go do that. And so the FBI was involved in this, CISA was involved with this, the CDC was involved with this. And then, of course, when we had the opportunity to take Anthony Fauci's deposition at NIH, that was mind-blowing. It's only the second time his deposition was taken, and we find out all the links at which he went to undermine people like, by the way, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who was a plaintiff in Missouri versus Biden with me, to undermine his efforts to say things like, well, natural immunity is kind of a thing still. I mean, they tried to take down this guy's career, and anybody like that who would just sort of question anything other than what Anthony Fauci said. So it really was a time that was wild and crazy, and we can't ever let happen again. That's the sort of the point. And for me, as you guys, I know this is I told Jason, first time, long time on the show now. Yeah. The First Amendment really is the beating heart of the Constitution. One of the great tests of this American experiment is our ability to tolerate people's point of view or their expression of a point of view that we vehemently disagree with, even if we think it's dangerous. Like, that's really a big part of what this whole thing's about. And what you saw during COVID in particular was people who never should have had this power were exercising in ways that you would have thought was from another country. You know what I mean? Like, this couldn't happen here, but it was happening here.
I don't know if you remember the FOIA lady. Literally, the person who was supposed to be policing and making sure that things were on the up and up at the CDC was teaching them, allegedly, how to use hacker speak or their personal email addresses to subvert freedom of information requests. I mean, I'll put allegedly in front of it, but I think this was all, discoverable and it was in the email. She just taught people how to lie and how to subvert.
They do this all the time. USAID has all sorts of videos as to how to protest, and they call it nonviolence when you destroy other people's property. So when you see in Ukraine, in the Maidan Revolution of 2014, the main square lit on fire, that's considered by USAID to be a peaceful protest because it advances U.S. economic interests. Sorry.
FOIA requests. So when you start saying Orwellian, it does feel like this absolute power has that ability to absolutely
Eric
corrupt.
mentioned the NGOs that are part of this Leviathan. I think that is a really important part of it, because I think that one of the ways that the Biden administration was able to kind of create cover for the censorship they wanted is to kind of launder those censorship requests through some of these NGOs, in addition to using the FBI and the IC and their connections to trust and safety. One NGO in particular I want to talk about or ask about is Hamilton 68. Did you look at this at all, Eric? Or
remind me which one Hamilton 68 is?
The reason I wanted to talk about this one is this idea of Russian disinformation, because Hamilton 68 was another one of these groups. This is all exposed in Matt Taibbi's reporting, where it was set up by another former FBI official named Clint Watts. These former FBI guys are kind of all over. And they claimed that they were tracking 600 or so Russian disinformation accounts or bots. And they claimed to know which accounts these were. And they would put out stories that whenever there was a story that Democrats didn't like, they would accuse the Russians of being behind it, amplifying that story. And this was the source for thousands of MSNBC stories, thousands of CNN reports, and so on, claiming that the Russians were involved in our politics, they were engaging in disinformation. Well, why is this relevant? Well, during the Twitter files, we found out there was Yoel Roth, who you mentioned was the head of trust and safety and definitely not a conservative. There was correspondence inside of Twitter saying, hey, we looked at their so-called API, and these are just regular accounts. And he said, basically, this is all bullshit. I mean, I think he used that word, bullshit. In other words, the whole idea they were tracking Russian accounts was just total nonsense. These were, it was just a random smattering of some were conservative accounts, some were Canadian accounts. They were just random accounts. And so anytime they needed to oppose conservative opinion on an issue, they would just supposedly point to this Hamilton 68 dashboard. Hamilton 68 created this dashboard that supposedly showed, this vast Russian influence campaign. It all ended up being nonsense.
Well, and I think it
totally created out of thin air.
I think
there's a long track record of the Russians hacking, including the RNC recently. So, I do think you are painting a very one-sided picture here, Sax.
Maybe it's all bullshit.
You think the Russians are not hacking foreign adversaries at all? You don't believe any of it?
Russia's got a lot of good hackers in it, and I'm sure they have cyber operations and things like that. But again, that's a little different than saying that the Russians are heavily involved in our elections. I believe that was largely a made-up story. Now, look, do I want to say that no Russian ever was involved in some sort of operation? I'm not going to say that, but we know Hamilton 68 was total nonsense. In fact, it was worse than that. It was a hoax. Okay, it was a hoax. And for years, it was the basis for thousands of stories that the Russians were interfering in our politics. We also know that the Steele dossier was a hoax, and that was the whole basis, once laundered through the FBI and that whole investigation, that somehow the Russians had interfered in the 2016 election. So when you start to peel away all these bogus accusations, Jason, I don't really believe any of this stuff. When I hear the word,
me either. I am done believing the narrative that the Democrats give. It's the boy who cried wolf over and over again, except instead of just getting a kick out of getting everybody riled up, they're stabbing the knife in the back of the U.S. Constitution and our freedom of speech.
Russian disinformation, what I hear now is Red Scare.
Senator, I'm going to have you, chime in here and maybe balance out our two opinions. Obviously, the Russians have been hacking political organizations in the United States and other countries for decades. They did it to the RNC. They did it to Hillary. They do it as a...
You're assuming that they did it to Hillary. We don't know that they did it to Hillary. Maybe. I'm done believing it. But you're stating it as fact, as a presupposition that we're supposed to go along with.
Tactic. That is a fact. And also, I don't think anybody thinks Trump is a Manchurian candidate. So you tell me where reality is between these two.
Chinese do it too. There's no question.
Yeah, Chinese are big on it, sure.
Of course. Yeah. But I think what separates this, though, was that now that we know what we know, I mean, actually, in the documents that were released by Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, was that Hillary Clinton was the preferred candidate. They had the goods on her. They had her medical records, all this stuff. So Trump was not like this preferred Putin
The Russians
candidate.
had all that hacked information.
The Russians,
correct.
Yeah, they had that. And so what was done was Hillary Clinton knew that she had an email problem. And then she works with a George Soros-funded NGO, right? They come up with this plan to say, well, Trump is cozy with Russia. The Steele dossier finds this Oppo, whatever is fake Oppo. Then they, as David said, they launder it through intelligence agents. Then that became the thing. And I think the problem is, and why people have lost trust in a lot of these institutions, in many cases rightfully so, is because they were really weaponized against political opponents and they were weaponized against the American people. And there's going to have to be a lot of accountability, I think, before people.
There has to be a ton of accountability so that people realize that if you F with the foundations of America, the institutions that we've trusted since I was a kid, that you end up in the slammer. Maybe worse, maybe shipped out to North Korea and the gulags there.
People gain that trust back. So I think
that was my next question, is how do we get past this? Because we're sitting here with one group who feels, hey, there's all these really suspicious Russian connections to Trump and the people around him.
But Jason, can't you see that this was manufactured? You have to start with
some parts of it are manufactured, yes, and then some parts of it real.
The Steele dossier manufactured. It was a hoax.
We get it. There's
Hamilton 68 and all the stories based on it. Manufactured hoax.
How do we get to reality where we
first
can
you got to peel back. You got to peel back all the fakeness.
Well, I think also you have to accept.
Thank you, David Sax, for exercising your superior intellect.
That the Russians are hackers and don't have our best interests at heart, and they actually want to come after us politically, David.
I'm sure the Russians have cyber operations.
The senator
I'm sure they do.
Us that they hacked Hillary, and he knows, and this has all been confirmed.
The problem here is that was used as a predicate. Again, this is why it's so jarring. It was used as a predicate to spy. Barack Obama authorizes to spy on a presidential candidate, and then as a predicate, then to investigate a president in waiting, and then as a predicate to try to destroy his administration. It was used and it gobbled up so much time in those first 2 years. That to me is a pretty unique circumstance. And beyond just, foreign nations are trying to get information.
Since we're here, there's this lawsuit that is now happening, or this investigation, I guess, as an attorney, and you were the AG. Explain to the American people what the case is right now that they're going after, with this Russiagate allegations. Yeah. And then where is it in the courts? Give us the mechanics of it, and where do you think it winds up?
So the question is, was anything done illegal during this sort of Russiagate hoax stuff that could be chargeable? I think you've got, ironically, Barack Obama has presidential immunity because of the case that President Trump won at the Supreme Court, which, by the way, my Solicitor General at the time in Missouri was John Sauer. He's now the Solicitor General of the United States. He was also Trump's lawyer who argued that presidential immunity case about a year ago. But so he probably has immunity from official acts when he was in office, but not when he's out of office. So the real question will be, a conspiracy. I think the most likely charge you can make the case is a conspiracy to defraud the United States. This is a very elaborate scheme again to undermine people, and whether they get indictments or not, I think they should pursue them, and we'll see if that happens. But I think the most likely targets of that are Comey, Clapper, and Brennan for their role.
And they're being accused of what exactly?
Of manipulating manipulating these falsehoods into actionable intelligence, again, against the president of the United States, Donald Trump.
What are they being charged with, I guess, is what I'm getting at, or has that not gotten to that point?
Yeah. You can't be the head of the FBI or the head of the CIA and have information you know is false to then open up a criminal investigation against the president, which is what happened, right? And so that's a kind of a big thing. So again, most people would say probably the statute of limitations has run on many of those charges. But again, an ongoing conspiracy is something different. And by the way, the conspiracy doesn't need to involve you from point A to point Z. Once you sort of begin the conspiracy. So again, it just go down this rabbit hole a little bit. Like, what was Jack Smith looking for at Mar-a-Lago when he went down there? Like, he's probably looking for some of the information related to the Steele dossier that they thought that he probably took with him. I don't know that for certain, but that's certainly a plausible explanation. So and again, you have to remember, Jason, that President Trump leaves office. He announces he's running for president in the fall of 2022. 3 days later, a few things happen then. The assistant district attorney in Atlanta in a state case visits the White House counsel's office. The number 3 person at DOJ leaves the Department of Justice and goes work for Alvin Bragg, who then later brings a case against President Trump. Jack Smith is appointed as special counsel, who's in prosecutor world, he's this hired gun. He goes out and tries to put President Trump in jail for the rest of his life. They try to bankrupt his family. So it is very obvious to anyone paying attention that this lawfare that was aimed against Donald Trump was meant to make sure he never got back in office again. And by the way, if he never got back in office again, all this stuff that Tulsi Gabbard discovered and laid out there that Kash Patel found in burn bags wouldn't be out in the open. So much like...
Correct. Just think about that, people. Think about how close we were to the U.S. descending into an Orwellian authoritarian state, which would eventually happen more quickly than one might think as they brainwash the public with their censorship and do everything they can to destroy the First Amendment. 2 millimeters, and we're done.
Like how we exposed the corruption in Missouri versus Biden, I think that's kind of where we're at right now. With
this is a big jump, though, because the FBI raid on Mar-a-Lago was because Trump wouldn't give back these specific documents that they were asking for. Right, but what were the documents
they were looking for? Right, what were the documents they were looking for?
And that he was obstructing justice, and that they were,
and that was
deleting
thrown
video
out.
cameras, etc.
And that case didn't get past a motion to dismiss. Right.
You're making the jump from that they were looking for something related to the Steele dossier. And Trump could have just given those documents back. So I always wondered in that one, why he just didn't give the documents back? Like, why was he so steadfast
He could
against them?
declassify anything as president, which was the likely scenario, but they did it anyway. I mean, I think.
But why wouldn't he just? I mean, if you were advising him, wouldn't you just tell him like, hey, just give the documents back? Like,
I think he was in touch with the archivist, and that was an ongoing conversation. And then Jack Smith with
The fact is, as president, whatever Donald Trump touches, he can declassify. So any document that he took could technically have been declassified. Therefore, he had no classified documents. It's so simple. But, Jason needs to run his little mind around it.
the federal prosecutor down in Florida moved with guns to seize these documents. Right? I mean, it's very unusual.
It was dramatic for sure. I just don't.
Right.
I mean, I just never understood why he just didn't give the documents back. It would just. I mean, I know Trump does unique things in the world, but I would have just given the documents back, which is what every other president did when they were asked to give documents back.
Sure. But except remember, Joe Biden, who wasn't ever president, he was vice president, who can't declassify documents, had boxes and boxes of classified documents in his garage where Hunter Biden lived. So,
he had
so
no
like it was
idea.
kind of a double
I love what
standard.
you're down to now, J. Cal. You started believing that Trump was a Russian asset. He was a Russian
never believed
spy.
that.
Yeah, you
No.
did. You
No,
were tweeting
no.
it at the time
I
for
thought we
years.
should. No, I didn't. I always
You
thought
did.
that was like a crazy
You
concept that he
deleted
was a
those
Manchurian.
tweets, but you did.
No,
It's
I always
okay.
thought
You were fooled by the media. It's
no,
okay.
No. I always
A
thought
lot of people
there
were fooled.
I said this very clear on the pod. I always believed the Russians wanted to create chaos, like we're experiencing here in this discussion, amongst Americans to distract us, and that they would do it even-handedly with anybody. They would do
The
it
people
with.
who were creating the chaos were actually the people who perpetrated this coup attempt against the president.
Correct.
The people who perpetrated the.
He's so well spoken. He speaks with such brevity. I love David Sachs. And again, he is our crypto czar currently.
Hamilton 68 dashboard fraud. Those are the people who perpetrated the chaos.
Sure, I think if the Russians
You don't
weren't
really have
hacking
any
everything,
evidence.
no,
you
the
don't,
Russians
you don't have
hacking is all.
specific evidence. You don't have specific
just
evidence of
listed
a
them.
Russian hack. Go
I
read
just-
Matt Taibbi's reporting.
I just gave
This
them
is
to you.
refuted.
I just gave it to you. The RNC, the head of the RNC said, yes, we were hacked. Our partners were hacked. They explicitly said this. This is all facts, David. But anyway,
No,
we
it's not.
got the senator here. We can have our Russiagate debate forever. You can tell me that
Yes, move on, Jason. Move on because you're getting smoked.
I think Trump's a Russian asset. I don't think Trump's a Russian asset. I think that's insane.
did.
But I do think the Russians like to cause chaos. Moving on.
Brennan, I believe it was Brennan, and these Tulsi documents that just got released. Here's what I think is so notable about them. I mean, other people may have their own opinion. Is that it shows that I think there's a document there where Brennan was like the head of the CIA.
Correct.
He received an intelligence assessment from the organization in which they said, look, there's nothing to this. It's bogus. We haven't,
The Steele dossier, you're saying?
not just the Steele dossier, but the whole idea of somehow that the Russians had run this elaborate interference operation in the 2016 election and that somehow Trump was compromised. In other words, the intelligence analysts did their job and came up with the correct conclusion. And nonetheless, Brennan said that the Steele dossier should be included in the official intelligence assessment because it had the, quote, ring of truth to it. Okay? So he was advised by his own analysts that this was nonsense, and yet he pushed to include it in the official intelligence report. And then that became the basis for opening the investigation. You see how this worked?
Allegedly, and we'll find out. He'll have their day in court. I mean, I'm totally fine
Allegedly,
with.
this is what's in the documents.
Well, I mean, we'll find out if this is a theatrical exercise or if it's actually going to go to court. What do you think?
I think it'll go to court. I think this is, and by the way, I think it's one of the reasons why they were so obsessed in making sure President Trump never got back into office. One of the reasons. I mean, again, in the book, I talk about how there's this an emergency, real or perceived, then you other people, and then you try to silence dissent. I think it happened with COVID. It happened with this anybody that claimed that Russia didn't have, that President Trump wasn't a Russian asset, was a traitor and a Putin lover. I mean, this stuff, it's kind of wild, honestly. But I think we're on the other side of the fever dream, but there does need to be some accountability now.
Look, I think one of the reasons why we can stop talking about Russiagate, but I think one of the reasons why it was so important, first of all, it was effectively a coup against the President of the United States, because these were executive branch officials who owe a duty of loyalty to the elected president. Instead, they were working to subvert and undermine him based on essentially lies and hoaxes and manufactured material. I mean, that is basically the definition of a coup. So I think that is a big deal in and of itself. But I think the other reason why it's such a big deal is I do think that it helped create this intense Russophobia in the United States that has led us to the point we're at right now, which is we are basically in a war with Russia, or at least we're backing Ukraine in a war with Russia. And actually, you heard this at the Alaska summit. I think that this whole Russiagate thing, which we now know is completely bogus, poisoned relations between the United States and Russia for years because the media kept reporting.
It is very likely that Russiagate helped precipitate the invasion under the weak-ass President Joe Biden. I'm not saying that Putin's a great guy. He's looking out for the interest of Russia, which is counter to the interest of the United States in some regards, certainly. But I do believe that it is much more likely that this would not have happened had Russiagate not taken place.
This bogus idea that somehow Trump was a Russian asset and somehow they had interfered in our elections. And I think this helped create a very hostile relationship between the United States and Russia.
Clearly, Russiagate led to the Putin invading Ukraine.
It led to a souring
crossing the border and murdering.
It led to a souring of the relationship.
Yes.
It led to a souring of the relationship.
Jason is not as smart as David Sachs.
And it
doesn't justify his murderous campaign in Ukraine, David. You would agree.
That is a straw man. That is a straw man. That's not what he's talking about.
That's not the argument I'm making.
I know,
exactly.
But I'm forcing you to agree that he invaded Ukraine and murdered people, and he's a war criminal. And those are just facts as well, David. I'm sorry.
I think those are cliches that basically attempt to strip that complicated war of all of its context, so that we can achieve a peaceful solution to it.
I'm all for peace, but you got to accept reality.
Obviously, Putin invaded the country, but the conflict there goes back 10 years. There's a long history to it.
Yeah.
I'm not looking to rehash all of that. The point is, we could have worked out a resolution to this conflict maybe before it started if we didn't have hostile relationships with Russia. And that's the point I'm trying to make.
Senator, I'll give you the choice. I want to talk to you about just the Senate in general, and then I wanted to talk a little in your experiences there, or we could just go right into what's happening with this Russian peace deal and the status of that.
We can do both. I was on a Sunday show yesterday, and
I saw it.
I consider myself firmly in the camp of being an American realist. I think that a lot of the people that are really critical of President Trump's efforts right now have been wrong about foreign policy for a very, very long time. Jake Sullivan included, right, who presided over the disastrous withdrawal in Afghanistan, who basically on his watch, Russia invaded Ukraine.
What is their position, Senator? What do you think their position is? Like,
well, that's the part of the problem.
Why are they so tweaked that he met with Putin, do you think?
I don't know, because there is no plan. There's never been a plan. The only plan they ever had is that the United States taxpayer would continue to funnel over $200 billion without a plan. And I had a problem with that in my first couple of years. Vice President Vance viewed the world kind of similarly with that in the same way. I think we ought to focus on our core national interests, the homeland. We have to figure out a way to pivot to China. We have to get our NATO allies to step up in a much more meaningful way. I think one of the great ironies of all this is that these European countries who are going to be in the White House in the Oval Office today, they talk about Putin being this existential threat. Well, they sure don't act like it. They don't really
spend like it, you mean?
Correct. And by the way, if they spent what we spent on national defense, that would free up about $300 billion for us to focus actually on the Indo-Pacific, where China now has a bigger Navy than we have. Not a better Navy, but a bigger Navy. They're in space for real.
Trump's biggest accomplishment is probably geopolitically getting NATO to spend what they're supposed to spend. Yeah.
Yeah. I went over to. I was actually at the Munich Security Conference. I went over there. I'm a bit of a contrarian there, I guess. I would say the ascending wing of the Republican Party on this kind of realism versus this kind of Wilsonian adventurism that's dominated permanent Washington for a long time, just to tell them the truth, which is not what they wanted to hear, but the truth, which is the things I just said. You need to step up in a more meaningful way. If you think about the Cold War, it was meant to sort of prop them up to defeat Soviet communism. Our trade deals were never renegotiated. We never expected much more from them, and all that's happening now. So this is kind of the place that I've been hoping to be. But I think President Trump's trying to broker a peace here. The problem with the critics is they just don't have an alternative. This is a meat grinder. This is a war of attrition. This is what Russia does. That's what they've done for centuries. So if your solution is that, well, we shouldn't talk to Putin. I don't know how you get to a peace deal. Diplomacy means you talk to some people that you would never want your daughter to marry, but like you accept the world as it is and try to move forward. And I think that's what he's trying to do.
And David, I think the chances of successfully negotiating anything with a dictator who gets to do whatever he wants is like 5 or 10% on a good day.
Are you talking about Zelensky?
My Lord, you have it in for the emerging democracy that was invaded.
Zelensky is now in his, was it fifth or sixth year of a 4-year term? Hold on, no, this is just me saying it. I'm not attributing anyone else.
You're out of your lane.
So Zelensky basically banned opposition political parties. He basically cracked down on the press.
Democracy.
You don't get to be a reporter in Ukraine unless you get a license from the government. He cracked down on religion, on the Russian Orthodox Church, priests, nuns, so forth. He's basically seized the assets of his political opponents. And most importantly, he's now in the 5th year of a 4-year term. He canceled elections. So I'm not quite sure upon what exactly you're making these highly moralistic condemnations. I just think the conflict is much more complicated than you would like it to be. And, this whole idea that Zelensky represents democracy, whereas Putin represents authoritarianism, that's not what's going on.
Just statistically, you're wrong. If you were to look at any of the ratings of democracies in the world, Russia would be amongst the lowest scores, and the Ukraine would be in the high middle scores compared to the truly free countries.
Maybe
like
before
ours
Zelensky canceled elections, but you have to think twice about that since he canceled elections. Look, there is no democracy. There is no democracy in Ukraine right now. There's just not.
Well, they're at war.
Okay, fine.
You can be at war and still have a democracy. England during World War II held elections. The United States did as well.
But, fighting for their lives.
But we had elections when we were in the Civil War, and we were in World War II. We had elections. I don't know that that's a great reason.
Senator,
not to have
which is
elections.
a more democratic country, Ukraine or Russia?
Russia is an authoritarian regime, but I think David makes some. I will give you one example. When we were
so you
going
can't just answer the question. I know.
Well, are you kidding me? Would you allow people to speak? This is somebody that has an ego that needs to be right about things instead of discussing. And he's just there getting beaten by 2 superior intellects and still trying to hold his cards based on a single definition and trying to corner somebody instead of getting nuance out of the conversation. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. What do you guys think?
And you're a senator, I mean.
You're using democracy as a bumper sticker and a buzzword instead of actually thinking about what it really means. And actually, if we're really going to think about what democracy means, then let's ask what the people of Ukraine think. That's what, to me, democracy means. You actually listen to the people. Gallup just did a survey of the people of Ukraine. Let's put these numbers on the screen. This is Gallup. This is before the Alaska summits. This was not politically motivated in any way. And what they found is that Ukrainians have lost their appetite for war. Support for the war has collapsed. A year ago, support for the war was in the 60s or 70s. Now it's collapsed to 24%. So the vast majority of Ukrainians now want a resolution to the conflict, even if it means making concessions.
Yeah, I know. I wouldn't. You can't dispute this. Of course, they've got war fatigue, like they should.
This is what democracy means to me: is that we should actually listen to the desires of the Ukrainian people.
Russia has 5 times the people, 3 times the people, 5 times the munitions. They have an industrial base. This, for Ukraine, I think the next step here is there has to be a negotiated peace here. This can't go on forever. Europe is not in a position, I think, to provide what they claim to want to provide. In the United States of America, I mean, part of the problem is, and other people have made this point, that even if you spent, let's just say we wanted to spend another $100 billion, the industrial base doesn't exist to build all of the stuff that they need right now anyway. There's a real problem here. And I think President Trump campaigned on the idea of negotiating peace. I don't know why that's so controversial. And I'm not saying from you, I'm saying, but the pundits. Yeah. It's like he can't, the idea that, Russia has nuclear weapons. The idea that he wouldn't have a one-on-one conversation.
Yeah. That's why I asked that question. Is there any steel manning of this position that we shouldn't meet with Putin or, President Xi or Kim Jong-un? We should obviously meet with all of them. It makes sense if we have even a 1% chance of making forward progress. When should the United States, Senator, say enough is enough? We're out. Figure it out for yourselves. You've got the EU right there. You got Europe. They've got plenty of money. But America's out. If you want to buy some weapons, we sell weapons. That's fine. And I think Trump has done an amazing job of enforcing the loan lease that Biden set these up. So when we keep saying we're spending $100 billion, that's no longer true, right? We're getting all that money back because Trump forced Zelensky to the negotiating table, and we're getting all that money back. But when should we, just so we have clear facts here, that this is not costing the American people, this hundreds of billions of dollars anymore, thanks to President Trump, deft negotiator, I'll give him credit, where credit is due. But when should we, in your mind, step back and say, you know what, not our problem anymore, you guys figure it out? Because that seemed Vice President J.D. Vance, friend of the pod's position as well. At some point, we have to say enough. And Trump sort of said that too. He alluded to that. At some point, we're out. Are we at that point if this doesn't get resolved this time around, do you think?
I think that that's what this phase is all about, which is to give a legitimate peace process a chance. But the idea that we're going to be voting on, I mean, I wouldn't support it, more taxpayer aid to Ukraine for a war that, doesn't seem to look like it's ever going to end and is a blank check, is just unacceptable as a senator for a state in the United States of America, right? Like, it's just not. Now, President Trump, I think, has opened up avenues to sort of make it clear to both parties that there's pressure that could be ramped up to try to bring this to a head. And I think that's where we're at. It's not going to all happen today. It's not going to all happen tomorrow. But that's really what this diplomacy, in this TikTok age that we live in, I think we think it's instant gratification. But diplomacy is difficult when you're dealing with other countries with their own national interests and their own sort of inner dynamics.
Possible we walk away this year from the situation, you think?
I don't know. I wouldn't want to put a timetable on. I would not want to get in front of the president who's actually sitting in front of across the table from these world leaders. But
fair enough.
Look, I think that he's been pretty clear. This is not our war. It's not our war.
Yeah.
But I think that up to this point, we've wanted to try to provide a time and space for a solution. And I do think if there's anybody who can do it, it's Trump. There's nobody else on the planet. I mean, Macron could not broker this. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, so it's the last best hope. My hope is that you do get to a peace process because you're just going to have billions of more people die. And really,
what do you think, Sax? You think we should walk away if we can't get this resolved with this latest volley of negotiations? Or at some point, should the president say enough? Because he seems exacerbated based on his public statements about this. He's kind of exacerbated with the two parties, it seems.
Well, look, you're asking me what the president should do, and I'm not on the foreign policy team.
Right.
I'm not going to venture and wade into that. But
is it a possibility?
I'll just say this. Listen to what the Ukrainians want. I mean, Zelensky's interests may not be the same as his people's, because as long as there's a war, there's no election. They've canceled democracy over there while the war is going on. And as long as that is true, he stays in power. So he has incentives that may not be true for all of his people. His people want a negotiated peace.
And you think if they give up the Donbass and whatever other regions are on the table here, do you think Putin stops here, or do you think we'll see him invade another country? Do you worry about that, Sax? Do you worry that this is enabling his behavior, his worst demons?
I don't think the Russians have the intention to invade another country, and they don't have the capability. Look at how much trouble they've had. We're now 3.5 years into the war. They're definitely winning the war, but they've only conquered this eastern part of Ukraine. They haven't
pretty
even
humbling
made it
for them. Yeah,
they haven't made it to the Dnieper. I don't even think they can conquer all of Ukraine, or at least it'd be extraordinarily difficult and resource consuming. So I just think that this thread of Putin conquering or attempting to invade all of Europe, this is threat inflation.
That's my takeaway from it, Senator. It's like Putin couldn't even take Ukraine. I mean,
agreed. Look, this is part of the inconsistency of the argument that I've heard in the Senate for 2.5 years, which is that he's Hitler, that he's about ready to march through Europe, and we can't be Neville Chamberlain, and this is the moment. But at the same time, he can't get to Kiev, right? Like both things can't be true at the same time.
And he's got
so again, I think you just have to recognize the realities.
Recruiting North Koreans to fight on the front line. I mean, like, what? It's so humiliating for him.
Guys, let me know what you guys thought of this discussion. I thought it was very interesting. I'm not a big fan of Jay Cal, obviously, but I love David Sax, and I thought Eric Schmitt offered some great insight as to the lawfare that was going on against Trump and his own taking on of the Biden administration. administration.